March 19th, 1945, the waters off Kure, Japan. Dawn had not yet broken over the inland sea, and beneath the black surface, something moved, silent, patient, invisible. The hull creaked softly under pressure. Inside the submarine USS Trigger, 38 men breathed recycled air that tasted of diesel and sweat. They had been submerged for 14 hours. The sonar operator, a 22-year-old farm boy from Nebraska named Danny Weiss, pressed his headphones tighter against his ears, listening. Around him, the world had become sound, the distant groan of a freighter's propeller, the rhythmic ping of depth charges blooming 2 miles north, and beneath it all, the low hum of the ocean itself, a kind of breathing, ancient and indifferent. The Japanese called American submarines URA ghosts, vessels that appeared from nowhere, struck without warning, and vanished before the destroyers could respond. But that morning, in the cold, dark waters off Japan's industrial heartland, the ghosts were learning to see. For 3 years, American submariners had waged a war of shadows. They had stalked convoys through typhoons, threaded minefields in the Marianas, and evaded destroyer screens with nothing but instinct and nerve. They operated alone, often hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly vessel, sustained only by their training and the cold knowledge that if they were caught, no one was coming to save them. The Japanese Navy had responded with fury. By 1943, the Imperial Navy had developed one of the most sophisticated anti-submarine doctrines in the Pacific: destroyer wolf packs, aerial patrols, magnetic anomaly detectors, and depth charge patterns so relentless that American submariners spoke of them in whispers and the way infantrymen spoke of artillery barrages. And yet, despite these defenses, American submarines continued to slip through. Not because they were faster or better armed, but because they had learned to listen. The transformation had begun quietly, almost unnoticed, in the research laboratories of the University of California and Bell Telephone. In 1942, while the war still raged in the Coral Sea and the outcome hung in balance, a team of physicists and engineers had been working on a problem that seemed almost abstract: how to make sound see underwater. Sonar, an acronym for sound navigation and ranging, was not new. The British had pioneered it during the First World War, and by 1941, both the United States and Japan possessed basic passive systems capable of detecting enemy vessels by the noise they produced. But passive sonar had a fatal flaw. It could hear, but it could not differentiate. A whale sounded like a submarine. A thermal layer could bend sound waves into ghosts. And in the chaos of battle, with destroyers churning overhead and depth charges detonating in every direction, passive sonar became a symphony of confusion. The Americans needed something better. They needed a system that could reach out into the darkness, illuminate targets with precision, and distinguish between a merchant vessel and a destroyer hunting them. They needed active sonar. But active sonar carried its own curse. The moment you transmitted a pulse, you announced your position to every enemy hydrophone within 20 miles. It was like firing a flare in a darkened room. You might see your target, but so would everyone else. For 2 years, American submarine commanders refused to use it. They trusted their ears, their instincts, their carefully plotted intercept courses. They remained ghosts by choice, knowing that the moment they revealed themselves, they would die. And then, in late 1943, something changed. The Navy's Bureau of Ships introduced the QLA Sonar Suite, an active-passive hybrid system that could transmit focused, low-frequency pulses designed to minimize detectability while maximizing range. It wasn't perfect. The Japanese could still hear it if they were listening carefully. But it gave American submarines something they had never possessed before: the ability to see through the murk, to measure distances with precision, and to calculate firing solutions in minutes instead of hours. More importantly, it allowed them to detect the one thing that had been killing them faster than depth charges: Japanese submarines. By 1944, the war beneath the Pacific had become a mirror image of the surface conflict. American submarines were no longer merely hunting merchant convoys. They were hunting each other's hunters. Japanese submarines, once regarded as among the most formidable in the world, had been tasked with destroying American undersea raiders. They carried long lance torpedoes, oxygen-fueled weapons capable of traveling 12 miles at 49 knots, faster and farther than anything the Americans possessed. They operated with a doctrine that emphasized stealth and surprise, waiting silently near choke points and convoy routes, listening for the telltale cavitation of American screws. And for the first year of the war, they had been devastatingly effective. The USS Grunion, Amberjack, Grampus all lost to Japanese submarine attacks or coordinated depth charge assaults that left no survivors. But the Japanese submariners expected the fight to remain what it had always been, a contest of silence, patience, and nerve. They expected American submarines to remain blind in the depths, relying on periscope glimpses and hydrophone whispers. They did not expect the Americans to turn the ocean into a grid of sound. They did not expect the ghosts to start hunting back. Full. Danny Weiss adjusted the gain on his sonar display and listened. The QLA system emitted a soft, rhythmic pulse, a chirp that traveled outward through the water at nearly 5,000 feet per second, bouncing off any solid object and returning as an echo. The delay between transmission and return told him distance. The frequency shift told him speed. The amplitude told him size. It was mathematics made audible, geometry rendered in sound. And on that March morning, 16 miles southeast of Cure Harbor, the echoes told him something was wrong. Frick, there was a shape out there, a shape that moved too smoothly to be a whale, too quietly to be a destroyer, and too deliberately to be a drifting mine. He marked the bearing on his chart, cross-referenced it with the periscope sweep his captain had conducted 10 minutes earlier, and realized what he was hearing. Another submarine, Japanese, running submerged, closing on an intercept course. He reported it in the clipped, emotionless language submariners used to convey terror without panic. Possible submerged contact, bearing 27 range 14,000 yards, course 090, speed 6 knots. The captain, a soft-spoken Annapolis graduate named Commander Raymond Holtz, moved to the sonar station and listened himself. Then he nodded. Battle stations torpedo. Load tubes 1 through 4. The crew moved in practiced silence, each man a component in a machine designed for one purpose: to kill before being killed. And in that moment, the Americans possessed an advantage the Japanese could not comprehend. They knew exactly where their enemy was. The Japanese did not. Historical records recovered after the war revealed the identity of the Japanese submarine that morning. The I-56, a Type-Bone Fleet submarine, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Masako Morinaga. The I-56 had departed Cure 3 days earlier, with orders to patrol the approaches to the Bungo Strait and intercept American submarines known to be operating in the area. Morinaga was an experienced officer, a veteran of actions in the South China Sea and the Solomon Islands. He trusted his hydrophone operator implicitly, a sailor who could identify the class of an enemy ship by the sound of its propeller alone. But that morning, his hydrophone operator heard nothing. The I-56 moved through the water in what Morinaga believed was total invisibility, unaware that 15,000 yards away, American sonar was tracking his every move, plotting his course with the precision of an astronomer charting a comet. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. The USS Trigger maneuvered into a firing position without surfacing, without breaking radio silence, without giving the slightest indication of her presence. At 647 hours, Commander Holtz gave the order. 4 Mark 18 electric torpedoes slipped from their tubes and ran silent and true, leaving no wakes, no bubbles, no warning. The I-56's hydrophone operator heard them only in the final 30 seconds, a high-pitched whine growing louder, faster, inescapable. 2 torpedoes struck amidships. The I-56 broke apart at a depth of 200 feet, her hull imploding under the pressure, her crew of 90 dying before they could understand what had killed them. The Trigger remained submerged for another 6 hours, listening to the destroyers that arrived too late, and then slipped away into the vastness of the Pacific. In his patrol report, Commander Holtz noted the engagement in a single sentence: enemy submarine destroyed via active sonar engagement. QLA functioned as designed, but the significance of that moment extended far beyond a single kill. What had happened in the waters off Cure was not merely a tactical victory. It was a technological and doctrinal revolution. For the first time in naval history, a submarine had hunted and destroyed another submarine using sonar alone, without visual contact, without guesswork, without luck. The Americans had turned the ocean, vast, opaque, and chaotic, into a legible battlefield. And the Japanese, who had once controlled those waters through skill and courage, suddenly found themselves outmatched by an enemy who could see in the dark. The Japanese Navy recognized the shift too late. By the spring of 1945, American submarines equipped with QLA sonar had sunk 16 Japanese submarines, crippled dozens of destroyers attempting anti-submarine operations, and turned the waters around Japan's home islands into a graveyard. Japanese submariners, who had once regarded themselves as the elite of the Imperial Navy, began to speak of American submarines not as ghosts, but as something worse, Oni. Demons who could strike from any direction, who knew where you were before you knew where they were, who made the ocean itself an accomplice in your destruction. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese submarine patrols grew shorter, more cautious, confined to defensive zones close to shore. The offensive doctrine that had characterized the early war years collapsed. And in the final months of the conflict, many Japanese submarines simply stopped going out at all, their crews unwilling to face an enemy who had learned to see underwater. The weapon that changed the war beneath the Pacific was not the torpedo, not the depth charge, not even the submarine itself. It was sound measured, analyzed, and weaponized. Sound transformed from a passive sense into an active tool, capable of mapping the invisible and rendering the hidden vulnerable. The engineers at Bell Telephone and the University of California had given American submariners something more powerful than steel or explosives. They had given them knowledge, precise and actionable, in an environment where knowledge had always been fragmentary and uncertain. And in doing so, they had overturned the fundamental assumptions that governed undersea warfare since the First World War. There was a recurring object in the stories American submariners told after the war, a symbol that appeared again and again in letters, memoirs, and oral histories. It was the sonar headset, the simple utilitarian pair of earphones that Danny Weiss and thousands of operators like him wore during their patrols. To the men who used it, the headset represented something larger than technology. It represented clarity in chaos, certainty in a world designed to deceive, and control in an environment that resisted control. When a sonar operator put on that headset, he was no longer blind. He was no longer guessing. He was no longer merely surviving. He was hunting. And that shift from prey to predator, from reactive to proactive, from improvisation to precision, was the essence of American industrial and intellectual power. The Japanese had built submarines as instruments of honor and sacrifice. The Americans had built them as instruments of efficiency and dominance. And when efficiency met honor, in the depths of the Pacific, efficiency won. The U.S. Trigger did not survive the war. On March 28, 1945, 9 days after sinking the I-56, she was lost with all hands in an engagement northeast of Okinawa. The exact circumstances remain unknown, but Japanese records suggest she was sunk by coordinated depth charge attacks from 2 destroyers. Danny Weiss died at his sonar station, headphones still pressed against his ears, listening to the end. He was 22 years old. His name is engraved on the memorial wall at the USS Bofin Submarine Museum in Pearl Harbor, along with the names of 3,700 other American submariners who never returned. But the technology he helped prove, the QLA sonar system and the doctrine of active acoustic warfare, outlived him by decades. It became the foundation of Cold War submarine operations, the basis for modern anti-submarine warfare, and the starting point for every sonar system used by navies around the world today. The ghosts of the Pacific taught the world a lesson that resonated far beyond the war itself. They demonstrated that victory belongs not to those who fight hardest or suffer most, but to those who adapt fastest and innovate relentlessly. The Japanese submarine force had been brave, disciplined, and skilled. But bravery without adaptation is simply a slower form of defeat. The Americans had taken an environment that resisted human perception, the ocean depths, dark and vast and indifferent, and made it knowable. They had turned science into strategy, engineers into warriors, and sound waves into weapons. And in doing so, they had proven that the true advantage in modern war lies not in the willingness to die, but in the ability to see, to learn, and to evolve before the enemy does. March 19th, 1945. 16 miles off the coast of Cure. A farm boy from Nebraska listens to the ocean and hears what no one else can hear. The echo of progress, the sound of the future, the frequency of freedom itself, measured in milliseconds and translated into survival. The ghosts were never invisible. They simply learned to see in a darkness their enemies could not comprehend. And that, in the end, made all the difference.